I guess we can get started, and I'm gonna share the screen. So welcome everyone. Again, this is webinar 3, and we will continue to hammer away at the psychology of well-being. And again, we're focusing on the effects of objective reality on well-being. And again, the textbook that we're using is The Psychology of Quality of Life. And as you see, we're on the topic of objective reality and its effects on happiness. Again, we're focusing on chapters 4 to 8. And in that context, we're talking, as a matter of fact, last time we started a discussion on the research related to technology, especially in media technology, on well-being and economic factors on well-being. And we will continue to do this. Today, we're going to try and finish all of these topics in relation to objective reality and its effects on happiness. So again, we've got a lot to cover. So I'm going to go pretty fast through this, and feel free to interrupt me anytime you need to, or you write or type your questions in the chat room. So what we did last time is we talked about the effects of media technology on well-being through what you call complementary processes and interference processes. And we talked about moderating factors and the sort of what I think will be a sort of like a seminal article that really captured much of the research in that arena is this one by Kushlayev. And then we started talking about all those economic factors and how they affect well-being in terms of economic fluctuations, market openness, income inequality, and unemployment, and inflation, and welfare. And this is where we stopped, I think, if I'm not mistaken. The effect of labor unions on happiness, or what you might call well-being. And based on actually, there are just only a handful of studies in there dealing with this topic. And in that context, they kind of capture the effect of labor unions in terms of membership in a labor union. And the most significant finding that came out of this research is captured in the second bullet, which is there's evidence suggesting that most vulnerable members of society who are most positively affected by membership in and the influence of organized labor in the industrial world, meaning that people who are poor and sort of disadvantaged in the context of the society at large are the ones that benefit from membership in labor unions. And probably the reason is pretty obvious, and that is that membership in labor unions doesn't only give them a sense of financial security, but also it gives them a sense of community, a sense of camaraderie with their fellow co-workers, especially those who it's like David and Goliath kind of battle between labor unions and management, and they think of themselves as essentially the David battling the Goliath. So it gives them a sense of solidarity, and that kind of spills over into a sense of well-being. So from that perspective, it sort of makes sense that, again, membership in labor unions tends to contribute to the sense of overall well-being, especially for those people who are disadvantaged and poor in society at large. Now let's focus on some of the political factors, and with the political factors. So we have, the research in well-being point to several factors: democratic governance, the effects of economic and political freedoms, participatory democracy, good governance, and war. So let's focus on the first one, which is democratic governance. And again, the idea is to make a very clear distinction between what you might call a democratic government versus, or countries that have democratic governments versus those that have what you call autocratic governments. I guess autocratic would be places like Russia and China, that these would be autocratic regimes. And places like in the United States and most of Europe, especially Western Europe, I guess we could talk about those countries as having democratic governments. So the evidence suggests that people are happier in countries that are more democratic than autocratic. Democracy gives them a sense of freedom and control over their community, economy, and societal institution, which translates into a control of their own lives. So again, that sort of makes sense in terms of an explanation of why living in a democratic country tends to make a difference on people's well-being. And this other point, I'm going to talk about it in the context of another slide. So I'm going to move on to talk about economic and political freedoms. And this is kind of interesting in the sense that the evidence suggests that economic freedom is positively correlated with levels of well-being of nations, especially in poor than rich countries. So if you're living in a country which is poor, let's say maybe in the heart of Africa, then it makes a difference to have economic freedom, because again, for poor people living in poor countries, again, having maybe the economic freedom to better oneself in the context of it being an entrepreneur, entrepreneurship as an institution makes a difference in people's lives if you are poor or living in poor countries. But then the situation reverses in the context of rich countries. Political freedom makes a greater contribution to well-being in richer countries than in poor countries. And again, the idea is possibly, or can be explained, let's say in the context of China, as we can see, there's, it is run by an autocratic government, and China has achieved a certain level of prosperity, which is good. But then once you achieve this level of prosperity, then people sort of turn into placing more importance on political freedom than economic freedom, because economic freedom allowed them to achieve prosperity. Now they shift their vantage point, so to speak, to political freedom, and that's why we see again maybe political agitation in places like China and in other countries in which they've achieved a certain level of prosperity, but nevertheless, they're not fully satisfied because they don't have the political freedom that they desire. So again, that sort of makes sense, and it is substantiated by good research. Participatory democracy, this is citizens in jurisdictions with higher rates of political participation report high levels of happiness than those living in places with lower rates of participation. And here in the bullet, I mentioned Switzerland, and Switzerland is something I can share with you, a sort of a personal anecdote. I used to conduct study abroad program, and I would take students to Switzerland, and we'd spend summers there. We teach them and we get them involved with the Swiss culture and the European culture at large. And it's kind of interesting. In Switzerland, Switzerland is divided into what you call cantons, which is like provinces or counties, or in some cases you can actually call them states. But there that they are cantons, and each canton have different levels of political participation. As a matter of fact, some people make fun of the Swiss because it seems like they're so politically involved, and they have a referendum on almost every social issue, which is great. But again, in the context of Switzerland, this kind of participation tends to vary from one canton to another. And therefore, those people who are more politically engaged in their canton tend to, again, experience a high level of maybe community well-being, ultimately spilling over into what you call life satisfaction. So again, that kind of research is fascinating. And we have some evidence to substantiate the fact that, participatory democracy does make a difference in people's well-being. And this is the point that I alluded to when we talked about democratic governance, and that is good governance. And the way social scientists and again, quality of life researchers have captured good governance is some sort of a composite index of what you call technical quality of governance, as in, captured by perceptions of government effectiveness, the regulatory quality, meaning how government is regulating industry and other institutions, the rule of law, how the rule of law is enforced, and control of corruption. Again, this is a composite of those dimensions that capture what you call good governance. And again, going back to the previous slides of democratic government, again, there is an allusion to this construct. And the research suggests that people living in countries characterized by good governance report higher levels of happiness compared to those living in countries characterized by poor governance. However, the relationship is more bell-shaped than linear, which is kind of interesting. Bell-shaped and linear. So again, we're talking about, if we're talking about, the kind of good governance to the extreme, you may think in terms of good governance as being autocratic, and places like China, or we already know that if you have good governance and it is up to the point where it might be construed as extreme, then again, it takes away, it detracts from a sense of autonomy and political freedom, which again takes a toll on well-being. So again, it's bell-shaped curve, which is again fascinating from that perspective. The moderator is that this relationship seems to be limited to only rich nations. And again, that sort of makes sense because again, people in poor countries are so preoccupied with so many other needs because they're poor and poverty stricken, that governance plays a very minute role in their overall lives, and therefore, again, this phenomena or this relationship is only evident in rich countries. Again, it makes sense to me, and I hope it does to you too. This is kind of very interesting. War-ravaged countries, and I guess we're living right through it right now in Ukraine, and if you ask people now how they feel about their lives, whether they're satisfied with their lives in a place like Ukraine, of course, it's very obvious actually that they will tell you that they're definitely not satisfied. So war takes so much from people's well-being. Um, but what's really fascinating in terms of the research, and as you can see from this slide, is that evidence suggests that war does not only affect life satisfaction of those individuals who are directly affected by war, but also their descendants' life satisfaction. So we're talking about descendants, meaning their children and their grandchildren, are affected by, again, war. It creates quite a scar, an emotional scar in people's psyche, to the point where it stays with you generation after generation, which tells you that, the idea of war is so destructive in so many different ways. Of course, well-being. Now we're going to move to talk about the effects of sociocultural factors. And the sociocultural factors, we talk about them in the context of social quality, social capital, cultural values, social change in the pace of life. So let's look at the research a little bit closely on the effects of those sociocultural factors on well-being. And let's start out with social quality. Social quality is kind of interesting. Quality of life researchers have captured social quality in terms of socioeconomic security, social inclusion, social cohesion, and social empowerment. And here I mentioned page 98. So if you have the book, you can actually look at the very specific measures of that. But let me just concentrate on at least an example of what socioeconomic security is. So you can actually think in terms of socioeconomic as financial security, but it goes beyond that because it doesn't only capture income, satisfaction with one's income, but also whether a person is troubled, literally troubled by paying the mortgage, paying housing expenses, or paying for healthcare bills, going to the hospital, for example, or going to some sort of having to do some sort of undergo surgery, for example, sinus surgery or what have you. Whether they come out of this situation with the kind of medical bills that would be overwhelming. Again, that is part of what we're talking about in terms of socioeconomic security. So the evidence suggests that those who experience high levels of social quality in their lives report higher levels of happiness than those who experience lower levels of social quality. So social quality definitely tends to impact overall well-being in many ways. Social capital is a related concept, and here what we're doing is really focusing on trust. Social capital is embedded in feelings of trust. Trust what? Who you're trusting. You're trusting, like, for example, employee trust in management, trust in family members at home, sense of belonging to the neighborhood or community, or trust in various institutions that make the country work. Again, the concept trust is so embedded in the idea, in the notion of social capital. And again, the evidence is very clear in the sense that social capital is positively correlated with subjective well-being. So those people who are very trusting in their institution, their family, their community, they experience a higher level of subjective well-being than those who are less trusting. Let's move on to cultural values. Let me see if you have any questions. I'm looking for the chat box and I can't find it. All of a sudden it disappeared. Okay, well, I hope you don't have any questions, but I'll look for it a little bit later.
So far, there's nothing in the chat.
Oh, okay. I'm glad to hear that. Sorry about that. Um, Cultural values and the effect of cultural values on well-being. Now, again, research indicates that there is, cultural values, they play a role in subjective well-being. And more specifically, we have at least two sets of values: individualism versus collectivism, and independence versus interdependence. Individualism versus collectivism, independence versus interdependence, they're highly correlated. Let me try and, if you live in an individualistic society, like, for example, in North America and in many places in Western Europe, your sense of, you feel quite independent. You're focused on your own well-being much more so than family well-being or the community well-being, or the well-being of what you might call the collective. But on the other hand, for those people that live in collectivistic society from places like India and many places in Asia and Africa, the Middle East, or what have you, actually, most of the rest of the world tend to be a little more collectivistic than individualistic, compared to Western Europe and North America. Even Latin America tend to be a lot more collectivistic than individualistic, and therefore more interdependent, based on the second bullet. So the idea is that if you're asking people how they're satisfied in their lives, well, that's a very individualistic question, very individual. So, if you're in a place like the United States or Canada, it's very likely that you will respond with that frame of mind. You're focusing on yourself. But then if you ask the same question, right, in a place like Japan or China or Thailand, again, people don't think in terms of their own individual happiness. They think of happiness in terms of the collective in terms of the extended self as, the extended, the family is involved, is included in the self. One's community, at least the immediate community, is also involved with the extended self. So the question tends to be a little bit confusing in the sense that, when you ask people in Asia who tend to be a little bit more collectivistic than individualistic, they tend to report lower levels of well-being because the focus is on themselves, and the question has to be rephrased in such a way to capture what you might call social harmony. Social harmony is a little bit more collectivistic, a little bit more interdependent, culturally speaking. So the idea that, we see a lot more people reporting higher levels of happiness in individualistic culture is because of the cultural framing of the survey items. Isn't that interesting? Then we have other things such as cultural acculturation. And that applies to people that move from one country to another, essentially immigrants and refugees. So when immigrants and refugees settle in another country, and of course we have this problem where, again, people from Syria and now we have a problem from Ukraine and a whole bunch of people from Africa moving into, migrating to Europe, and of course in the United States we have the same problem where people from South America essentially migrating or trying to come into the United States, and that seems to be causing a problem. And at least in some people's minds. So the idea of cultural acculturation is the extent to which, people who are immigrants and refugees settle in and they become part of the uh, receiving society, so to speak, the receiving society. Some people who are immigrants tend to fit well more than others. Like, back during the Trump administration, Donald Trump um, is very much against immigrants because he believed that immigrants, especially from places like in South America, they have a problem acculturating, fitting in, so to speak, right? But people from Northern Europe, for example, they don't have a problem fitting in. So he said, yeah, they can come in, but those people who are from the South America, no, they don't come in because, again, the problem of acculturation. And again, we have the same problem in Europe all over the place. We can see, for example, in places like Hungary and Poland, where some of the refugees and the immigrants that were not fully acculturated were literally ostracized by society at large. So they're treated as people on the fringe, so to speak. Cultural efficacy is another concept that has sort of been propagated by sociologists and cultural anthropologists. And that is, it really applies more, it applies to more to people of minority status. And I'm thinking in terms of, let's say in the United States, besides we have the Latinos, and we have the Native Americans as our Indians, so to speak, the American Indians, and then we have. So again, if we're talking about something like the American Indians, these are sort of indigenous people, and for those that do not identify themselves as American Indians, again, sociologists, or what you might call cultural anthropologists, would label them as having low cultural efficacy, meaning that they don't have a positive identity in terms of feeling proud of their own culture. So again, if it would be an indigenous population such as, you can also apply the same concept to the Australian Aborigines, for example, or the Maori population in New Zealand. Some of them, feel a sense of pride in their own culture, the indigenous culture. Others don't. Those that do not feel that sense of pride, it takes a toll on their sense of well-being. And again, the evidence supports this idea. Social change. Again, those who are less happy tend to be adversely influenced by social change. Economic recessions, decolonization, urban development, westernization, large-scale migration. In other words, the adverse impact of social change can be buffered by the person's level of well-being. Let's focus on social change in terms of what's happening right now. What's happening right now is the pandemic, right? COVID-19. And there's so much evidence now, just in the context of COVID-19. Now we're realizing that COVID-19 doesn't affect people who tend to be happy. If people are happy to begin with, they buffer the effects. They buffer the effects of this kind of social change that is very disruptive to their lives. So again, COVID-19 made us realize that, this kind of social change, adverse social change, negative social change, um, tends to be much more disruptive to people who are vulnerable. And if you think in terms of vulnerable population, these people have a lower levels of well-being to begin with, right? So they are more severely affected by social change, severe social change, such as the pandemic or COVID-19, than what you might call less vulnerable population. So well-being creates this buffering effect. It protects people from, the adversity of social change. Does that make sense? I hope so. Pace of life. Now, this is another thing that is truly fascinating. We tend to think, okay, quality of life, if you want to have quality of life, you need to kind of slow down your pace of life, right? Slow things down because, too much takes away from quality of life. But the evidence suggests the opposite. Interesting. So the pace of life, high pace of life means less time for leisure and recreation, right? As captured by those people who do this kind of research. But the evidence suggests that increases in the pace of life, are associated with increased happiness. So a frantic pace of life increased happiness? Well, at least the explanation that was put forth to explain this odd phenomena, I think it's odd, is modernization theory. And that is, for those people that live in, for example, urban areas in which the pace of life is much more hectic than in places like rural areas, in which the pace of life is much slower, is because these people tend to exercise the fruits of a higher living standards. So people living in urban areas have higher living standard compared to, again, those people living in rural areas. And that may explain at least the study finding.
Doctor, I wonder if it's similar to money increases your happiness only up to a certain point, like the $75,000 limit, pace to a certain point increases, and then after that it might drop off.
Absolutely, I would vouch for that. I think it sort of has a point of diminishing returns. Yeah, nicely put. Yeah, I think so. So if, for those people who want to sort of further investigate this phenomena, you may find this diminishing point of diminishing return where when it becomes too hectic, the pace of life is, too hectic, then you end up suffering. At least your well-being would suffer accordingly or proportionately. That would be another way of looking at it. Thank you, Susan, for making that comment. Makes sense. And talking about that, let's move into sort of financial resources. And so the effect of income and wealth. And there's so much research in quality of life dealing with the effects of financial resources on well-being. One of the, there was a phenomenon, well, there was a study back in the early 70s by Richard Easterlin, who is an economist, a happiness economist, actually. He's the one who was one of the founding fathers of happiness economics. And he came up with a study that showed that increases in wealth over time. So let's say, if a person, if you conduct a longitudinal study, and if you measure the person's living standard or income, and that person or that family is making more money over time, you would expect that their happiness will increase proportionately to their increase in income or wealth. But that's not the case. You found out that essentially when it comes to happiness or well-being, it's a flat line. And when it comes to wealth, it increases. So again, then there seems to be no correspondence between increases in income and increases in subjective well-being. So this, in happiness economics, we call this a paradox. And again, because Richard Easterlin from the University of Southern California came up with that study, it became well known as the Easterlin paradox. The Easterlin paradox, as you can see in the slide on the long-term effect in terms of the individual level. So you can actually, break down the studies in happiness economics in terms of short-term versus long-terms and individual versus national level. And the Easterlin study is more long-term at the individual level, but again, it was duplicated at the national level because, as you can see, at the national level, you still have the Easterlin paradox. It's revisited at the country level. But the explanation for, at least actually Richard Easterlin came up with that explanation. Says the reason why happiness is not increasing proportional to increases in income is because when people make more money, what do? Their expectations, right? Their lifestyle expectation in terms of their living standard types of expectations and aspirations climb up that ladder proportionately. So the more money you make, the more you expect more. And if your expectation is rising to the point where you're making, so again, satisfaction in life is a function of meeting or exceeding certain expectations. So if you're meeting your expectation, or if you're not exceeding those expectations, you feel kind of blah, or you feel neutral. So you don't feel highly satisfied. You only feel highly satisfied when your actual state of affairs exceed your expectations, or what you might call economic aspirations. So if your aspirations rise with your income, you're not going to feel more happiness. Your well-being will not increase. So this is what we call, again, if you look at the slide, explanation, rising material aspirations kind of creates a diminishing effect. It diminishes any possibility of increases in well-being. And that explains, at least partially, the Easterlin paradox at the individual long-term level. There is another explanation, which is a buffering effect, and that is increases in income doesn't really produce happiness. It doesn't generate increases in well-being. It only has a buffering effect on the adversities of life. So it helps you cope with life's adversities, but it doesn't really add to any happiness per se. That's what you call the buffering effect explanation. But on the short-term basis, if you look at the studies that capture increases in cross-sectional surveys rather than longitudinal surveys, and again, we're looking at the quadrant in terms of short-term individual level, people with higher incomes on average are happier than those with lower income. And that has been substantiated through a whole bunch of different studies. But again, like Susan was mentioning, there is a point of diminishing return. While you make so much money up to a point, well, making more money is not going to make much of a difference. It becomes monotonic rather than linear in progression. Now, what's the explanation for that? And the explanation is, well, you got assets hypothesis. The assets hypothesis that the more assets you have, the more you can, it's just like the buffering effect in terms of long term. You have more assets to counter the adverse events in your life, as well as indulge in luxuries that would give you a sense of greater pleasures in life. That's what you call the assets hypothesis. Now, there are other explanations such as self-esteem, control, optimism. Now, that explanation says that if you make more money, making more money, especially in a Western culture, is equated with success. As a matter of fact, success in life is measured in terms of how much money you make. In the United States, this is a cultural phenomenon that is widely accepted. So the idea then, if you make more money, then you become successful, and becoming successful kind of feeds into your self-esteem. It boosts your self-esteem. It gives you a greater sense of optimism. It gives you more control over your life. And because it does that, then you see this relationship between increased income and increased well-being. And that's another good explanation. The last explanation is again equally fascinating. It says, wait a minute, there's a cause and effect kind of a conundrum. And the conundrum is, wait a minute, it could be the opposite, and that is happy people tend to produce more income. They generate more income because they are because they have the repertoire of happiness allows them, motivates them to achieve more in life, because achieving more in life gives them this sense of life satisfaction, and therefore it's equated as such. And therefore happy people tend to make more money. It's not the other way around. So it's reverse causality. This is what we call the top-down hypothesis. Okay, I'm going to move on because again, we have so much to cover, and last time I took more time than I needed. So I'm going to leave this discussion on the national level. And I'm just going to say something which is pretty simple, and that is the same theoretical notions, same kind of findings, as well as theoretical notions that have shown at the individual level also apply at the national level. Okay, now let's move to talking about the effects of demographic factors, from age, gender, marital status, ethnicity, minority status, education, and so forth, and see what the research is telling us about the effect of these on well-being. And let's start out with age. Now that's kind of a very interesting concept. Well, not concept, I mean, a phenomena in terms of, does age have an effect on well-being? And now, what's the research in this area is paradoxical. Paradoxical in the sense that you end up with all kinds of conflicting findings, But there seems to be a trend. The majority of the studies show that the relationship may be U-shaped. U-shaped, meaning young people and older people, not the very old, tend to experience a higher level of well-being than people in the middle age categories. And the explanation is, well, the middle age categories, there's all kinds of life events that may create adversity, and people end up moving from one job to another. They end up getting divorced. All kinds of things happen in middle age compared to, again, those people who are maybe teenagers or young, and they're not embroiled in life's troubles, so to speak. They focus on being with friends and happy. And people who are older, especially retired, the retired people, they tend to devote their time and energies in terms of engaging in life events that tend to be much more pleasurable than those people in the middle age. So at least this is one explanation. But again, the research is so convoluted. So again, for those people who are doing this kind of research, they've identified a whole bunch of moderators. Well, so it depends. It depends on this. It depends on that. Okay, depends on what? Gender. Men fare better than women in midlife. They do better in the job market. Women suffer more in midlife when divorced or separated. That may be another explanation for why people in midlife tend to, again, experience a little bit more lower levels of well-being than the young and the old. The well-being dimension itself is a moderator, and that is positive affect remains stable with increased age, but negative affect decreases, right? Negative affect decreases in age. And the reason being is because, again, people with maturity, they tend to adapt. And through adaptation, negative affect is experienced less. So again, that may be one explanation. Varying satisfaction level in various life domains. So if you don't focus on life satisfaction at large, but you focus on domain satisfaction, and you see there's quite a bit of differences between being satisfied in different life domains as a function of age. So let's say older people are more satisfied with their finances, especially in retirement, because they've accumulated wealth over the years. But they are less satisfied with their health. All kinds of health problems is experienced with when you get older. Arousal. There is, in the psychology of well-being, there is a model which is called the circumplex model, and that is that happiness or positive affect versus negative affect is captured not in terms of the only positive emotions versus negative emotion, but also in terms of the level of activity or the level of arousal associated with those emotions. So if you're very active and aroused and you're happy, that's a true measure of positive well-being, or well-being at large, or positive mental health, or positive, mental health. That's a good way to actually look at it. But age tends to play a role on the arousal dimension of well-being, meaning that as you get older, you feel less excited, less aroused. So by definition, it takes you feel more positive emotions, but possibly less aroused. So it depends on the measure on how you're capturing well-being. So that's, again, it becomes a moderator. At the country level, again, we have different age may play a role on well-being in a differentially. How does that take place? And again, based on what I see there, retired people in the United States are happier than their Russian counterparts because the retirement system in Russia, for example, has suffered during its political economy transition, right? Which makes sense. So if you have that kind of situation, that at the country level, you see a different age effect on well-being. Then we have possible moderators, but there's so many mediators to explain this phenomena, as the positivity principle, the maturity principle, and so forth. Again, for the sake of time, I will, actually, this is a good break point. Let's take 10 minutes break, and then we'll start discussing the effect of gender on well-being, because this is very controversial, and we probably need to talk a little bit about it a little bit more in depth. Okay, so let's take 10-minute break and come back. We'll see you in 10 minutes. Okay, maybe we can resume. Hello, everyone, especially those who just joined us. So we're right in the in discussing the effects of demographics on well-being, and we finished talking about age, and now we're going to talk about gender. And I wanted to mention something in the book. Now, when we talk about the effects of age on well-being, in the book, you can get a whole lot more detail about the research on that topic. In part 5 of the book, again, it's divided, it gets into what you call population segments and well-being. So I have on chapter 24, there's a whole chapter on the well-being of children and youth. And it's divided in terms of the well-being of children of preschool age, the well-being of children of elementary school age, the well-being of children of middle school age, the well-being of adolescents, college students, and so forth. And so you get into the research that is divided by these different age categories. And then I have a bunch of psychological explanations about the effect of what's happening at that age that influences their subjective well-being in terms of social development theory, attachment theory, ecological theory, and then I get into a whole bunch of factors that affects well-being of children, situational factors, personality factors, social factors, socioeconomic and sociocultural factors, and so forth. Then I have another chapter on older adults. So again, we get into the elderly, and we get into aspects of how do gerontologists, for example, measure well-being from an elderly perspective. So we get into a whole bunch of measurement issues and conceptualization issues in that context. And then I get into a whole bunch of theoretical explanations of how life events affect the elderly in a very different capacity, in a very different way, compared to, again, people in middle age and people who are young. And we talk about things like activity theory, socio-emotional selectivity theory, selection, optimization, and compensation theory, continuity theory, innovation theory. These are some of the theories that have been sort of propagated in the research literature in gerontology and well-being. And then I get into a whole bunch of factors that affects the well-being of seniors, such as health-related factors, personal values, social factors, residential factors, social and leisure activities, and socioeconomic factors. Then chapter 26, I get into, and this is where we're going to start talking about gender. I have a whole chapter on the well-being of women. So whatever I'm going to say now can be further qualified when you read the chapter on women, because there's so much research on that topic. So in that chapter on the well-being of women, I get into a whole bunch of explanations of how women's well-being tend to be different from men's well-being. And there's a biological explanation, there's a psychological explanation, there's a cultural explanation, a psychographic explanation, a healthcare explanation, a socioeconomic explanation, on and on, a social role type of explanation. And I get into a whole bunch of factors that affects women's well-being, from family and cultural factors, economic and work-related factors, residential factors, health-related factors, factors related to the feminist movement, on and on, right? So again, what we're going to just talk about in terms of gender, how it affects well-being, has to be qualified when you read this other chat, or these other chapters, especially when it comes to age too, because there's so much there, and there's so much to learn from that kind of research. So gender, as you can see, do you see the slide, or is it, the slide is still there, right? On gender.
Yes, we can see it.
Great, thank you. So evidence suggests that men are slightly more satisfied with life than women. Evidence also suggests that women experience more positive and negative affect or emotions than men. So there's much evidence to substantiate those two claims. Again, a marginal difference between overall life satisfaction. But when it comes to emotions, positive and negative emotions, women tend to experience much more positive and negative emotions than men. Does that make sense? Anyone would like to comment?
So are you saying more emotions overall?
Overall, what? Say it again.
It sounds like you're just saying they experience more emotions overall.
No.
More
No,
positive and more negative.
More positive, so they're more elated, they're more joyful, they're more happy, and more negative, they're more depressed.
Yep.
And as a matter of fact, the literature on depression shows there's most patients, depressives, tend to be women than men. But again, there's a whole bunch of other explanations of why we see this. One possible explanation, as we get into this literature, and if you get into the chapter on women, is the healthcare factor. Is that women tend to seek more help from the medical community than men. So maybe the difference is confounded by the fact that women, they go to psychiatrists and psychotherapists and other type of mental health professionals than men. Men, for some reason, if there's a social stigma. If you do that, you're not man enough. So that would be just one explanation. But again, the research is just absolutely fascinating in the sense that there's all kinds of research findings and all kinds of explanations. And for those people who are into that, then again, I urge you to get into it a little bit more by exploring that literature some more. As you can see from the slide, there is an age moderator in the sense that it depends on age. Women start out their adult life happier than men, but as they become old, they become unhappier. And it's interesting, unhappier compared to men. This interaction effect may be due to changes in satisfaction in two domains, financial and family life. Financial in the sense that, you know, if they end up getting separated, then a lot of women, especially traditional women, they put all their eggs in one basket, and that is the basket of the family, the basket of they count on their husbands, you know, to be the breadwinner, and therefore when they get separated or divorced, financially speaking, they suffer. And when it comes to something like family life, you know, the older women get, if they put all their eggs in the family basket, and now the children are out of the house, they're out of the lives, that they kind of strikes them in a sort of an existential crisis, a midlife crisis of sorts. So that may be an explanation for that age effect. Age moderation effect. Okay, let's move on to talk about marital status and the effects of marital status on well-being. And here again, the research is very rich. We have marriage, for example. Well, what's the effect of marriage on well-being? Well, the overwhelming research is the fact that people who are married are happier than those people who aren't unmarried. But again, there's a whole bunch of qualifiers there. And I don't think I had enough room in here to put in, you know, moderators. And ultimately, you know, the obvious moderator in marriage, the effect of marriage on well-being is relationship quality. If you have a marriage that is blessed with relationship quality, then of course both partners, both parties in that marriage feel a greater sense of well-being than those that are besieged by what you might call a negative relationship, or a relationship that doesn't have much quality in it. So that is an important moderator. But in general, you know, on the average, if you compile all the data, you see that those people who are married tend to report a higher level of well-being than those who are unmarried. Parenthood, non-significant relationship between parenthood and well-being, you know, and this is because parenthood is what you might call a double-edged sword, double-edged sword in the sense that, my goodness, you know, people strive to become parent. You know, there is sort of an instinctual drive to become a parent. If you don't have kids, then you feel empty. You feel this sense of void. But then when you end up with kids, you pull your hair out because kids can cause quite a bit of turmoil in your life. I have 4 daughters. I can attest to that. Well, there are joys and other types of feelings that you may have when you do parenting. Excuse me. Let's see. Divorce. Divorce. Divorce is traumatic, causing significant decreases in well-being. You know, for those of you who have been divorced, you probably can attest to that. It really takes a toll on well-being, but usually it's short term. It's short term. So, it goes down, but then climbs up. But on the other hand, there is quite a bit of research that suggests that when it comes to eudaimonia, eudaimonia, eudaimonic well-being. Remember, we made the distinction between hedonic well-being, that we talked about, and eudaimonic well-being, in the sense eudaimonia deals with personal growth. Sometimes you say that no pain, no gain. No pain, no gain. Meaning that in life, you experience pain. And in many instances, that pain causes you to gain in life. Meaning you experience growth, development, more maturity. You learn from your mistakes, but you suffer through those mistakes, right? So divorce is a big mistake, it's a learning experience. And some people come out of the divorce much more mature, much more developed. They grow, right? They experience eudaimonia. So divorce, again, it's kind of interesting to look at it from that perspective. Widowhood. Widowhood is something that is a little bit different than divorce. Widows generally do not fully recover and return to their earlier level of life satisfaction. Really takes a toll. Because if you're thinking about, older people and they lose their life partner, in many instances, when one person loses his or her partner, they end up following suit or following their footsteps to the grave. It really takes a toll on people's well-being. Parental divorce. What is parental divorce? This is when children divorce their parents. They become emancipated, so to speak, right? Well, you think that's a good thing? Well, not necessarily. Research shows that those children that become emancipated, that divorce their parents, they sort of run away, maybe, right? Experience much lower levels of well-being than those people who stick with their families until they become fully independent. Cohabitation. The research is those people who cohabitate versus those people who, again, are married, formally married. There's no difference. Now, I'm thinking in terms of maybe some of the Nordic countries. In Nordic countries, for example, I have my son-in-law is Swedish. He was born and raised in Sweden, and he tells me flat out, we don't get married much in Sweden. It's kind of, I laugh at that. You don't get married? So we only get married if we want to have kids. So that's kind of odd, but it's part of the culture. So I guess when it comes to a place like Sweden, you don't see much of a difference between those people who are cohabitating and people who are formally went through the, this whole spiel of matrimony, holy matrimony, right? Adoptive and blended families versus what you might call nuclear families. Again, inconclusive study findings. It all depends on relationship quality. Same-sex marriage and partnership. It all depends on, again, relationship quality. So again, the findings are very inconclusive. Okay? Ethnicity and minority status. Now, again, if we're in the context of the United States, we have minorities, and evidence suggests that certain ethnic and racial minorities, like, for example, African Americans in the United States report lower levels of subjective well-being relative to other groups. You know, so what are the explanations? There are several explanations. And the explanations that have been sort of put forth by sociologists who are interested in well-being is racial ethnic discrimination, racial ethnic identity, acculturation and inculturation, and racial and ethnic socialization. Let's say something about each. Racial ethnic discrimination, well, that's pretty obvious, and that is, you know, minority people, minority individuals, you know, they suffer lower levels of well-being because they are prejudiced. People are prejudiced against them, and they feel discriminated. And yes, there's quite a bit of evidence that suggests that to support this type of explanation. Another explanation is racial ethnic identity. Because they see themselves as lower status compared to other groups. So, you know, in particular, if we're use the African-American minority individuals in the United States, there is a stigma associated with being Black. Although it's sort of dissipating in the United States, nevertheless, there is a lingering lower social status, you know, for that minority group than others. It's kind of interesting when it comes to Asians in the United States. It's the other way around. It seems like, yeah. So it depends on exactly what kind of minority you're in, and whether that minority is stigmatized, ostracized, or held in on a high pedestal. Acculturation and inculturation. Now, we talked about acculturation in the way, again, people, when they move from one country to another, like immigrants, acculturate, meaning they fit in, they try and speak the language, they try and eat the same food, they watch the same shows on television, and they emulate much of what you might call the traditions, the customs, the rituals of the natives. That's acculturation. So again, the idea that African Americans, if you use that as an example, have lower levels of well-being is because they fail to fully acculturate to what you might call the dominant culture in the United States, which is a white culture, right? Anglo-white, which is the Anglo-Saxon culture. Now, inculturation is a sort of a different phenomenon. Inculturation is the extent to which you fit in within your own group, subculture group. So again, if there is such a thing as an African American culture, which there is in the United States, whether you feel comfortable in your own skin, whether you feel comfortable in your own subculture, and that is what we call inculturation. You know, talk about all those people who were involved in the Black Lives Matter movement. You know, these people are enculturated. Enculturated, I mean, they feel good in their own Black skin, so to speak, right? And if you feel comfortable with who you are as a minority status person, then that doesn't affect your subjective well-being. As a matter of fact, there's evidence suggests that if you are fully enculturated, then your subjective well-being increases. So that's move on to. Okay, I have just barely a couple of minutes, and we certainly did not. So we have still much to cover, education is a conundrum in the sense there's all kinds of conflicting findings. So I urge you, if you're interested in education, the effect of education on well-being, read the chapter, because again, there's positive relationships and there's all kinds of explanations for that. The negative relationship, and there's an explanation for that. Moderators of all kinds, and again, the research is very rich when it comes to education. Then we get into the effect of personal activities, and in that context, there's all kinds of theories to explain how engaging in certain kinds of activities affect subjective well-being or personal well-being at large, from classical conditioning theory, activity theory, flow theory, personal expressiveness theory, self-determination theory. Again, really good theoretical ideas that explain a plethora of research. So again, we have quite a bit of research on theorizing how engaging in certain personal activities do affect well-being. So I urge you, if you're interested in personal activities such as physical activities, if you're into physical activities and you're trying to do research on how physical activities affect well-being, then there is a seminal article that I cited in this slide that you definitely need to check out, by Macaulay and Morris, 2007. There is, if you're interested in the effect of social activities, again, the research is very rich in that area, and the effects of leisure and recreation activities on well-being. And again, there's much to discuss in the context of that chapter. Spiritual activities, if you're into that, there's quite a bit of that too. Consumption activities, again, in the last 15 years or so, there's quite a bit of research on consumption activities and how it affects well-being. Again, if you might be interested in that, there's quite a bit of discussion in the book on that. And I'm so sorry that we're not going to have time to talk about this. Then we get into biology. And in biology, again, we talk about the effects of gene, the hormones, the stress, anxiety, depression, food, sex, and drugs, diet, quality, sleep, physical exercise, obesity, body image, diurnal preference, and day of work. And I'm so sorry we're not going to be able to talk about any of this today, because we need to, next time when we get together, we're going to jump into subjective well-being, because again, the research and the topics in subjective well-being are just, there's so many, and we'll need to devote time and space, to doing that. So let's see, let me just look at if you have any questions. Oh, you have, Susan is addressing, the whole class. Thank you, Susan. Very nice. Any other questions? Comments, concerns? Are we all on the same page, progressing, getting into the substance of the research, and hopefully you're making use of it in your own research, hopefully. And whatever well, for those of you who are not into research, you're involved in this kind of endeavor, again, from a practitioner perspective. I understand Susan is, for example, is one of them. Okay, so I wish you farewell, at least for the time being, and I will see you next Tuesday.
Thank you.
Okay, bye now.